Were we wrong about the Dane Axe? So the assumption for decades amongst historians and reenactors, living historians, is that the Dane Axe was kind of like a poleaxe or a two-handed sword of the later medieval period, used in massed ranks, used in melee, perhaps to mess up enemy shield formations, and additionally also used by bodyguards. Basically a bit like an early medieval version of the Renaissance montante. But in fact, was the housecarl Dane Axe actually a specialised anti-cavalry weapon? And was the evidence right there, staring us in the face all along? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms, and in this video we're going to be looking at, was the famous Dane Axe, or perhaps more correctly termed the Great Axe, as featured famously in the Bayeux Tapestry, more about that later, was it actually a far more specialised weapon than perhaps we'd realised before? So in this video we're going to be looking specifically at Peterson's type M and L. I think they are large, thin-bladed, we'll talk more about this detail in a second, thin-bladed but very long cutting edge, and on a long two-handed shaft, Dane Axe as they're commonly termed. And of course these are quite famous in the modern world, but they were actually quite unusual and exceptional weapons when they first appeared, probably in the 10th century, and made famous by the housecarls at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. So what I'm not referring to here are later derivative or related types of two-handed axes, like this 15th century poleaxe replica here, or Spartax or things like that, that we find in Ireland, used by the Galaglass. We're talking about specifically 11th and 12th century, really, two-handed great axes. And of course one-handed axes had been around for a long time. So this replica famously is from Thor's Forge by my friend Tord there in Sweden, as is this one-handed example here. Now in context, these one-handed axes in fact were far more common in the early medieval, migration and Viking eras. Very common, and obviously used usually with a shield, usually a boss-gripped flat Viking style shield like this one. So these were very common weapons used all over Europe, and in fact even in places like Italy the Longobards were famous for using axes. Now one thing we have to note is that this isn't just a big version of this, and that's a really important thing that you know if you don't know it already from watching my previous videos on this particular type of axe. So these type of axes are thicker bladed and obviously smaller. Now you can obviously see on camera the size difference between this and this, and it should be pointed out as well that both these types of axes are featured on the Bayeux Tapestry. You can clearly see smaller one-handed axes sometimes thrown, and it's mentioned axes being thrown in the written sources as well. We'll talk more about the written sources in a second. But not only is this just much bigger, but it's not actually colossally heavier. Now, the reason for this is that these Dane Axe blades are very thin. Very thin. We'll come back to that in a second. So it's important for you to know, if you didn't know already, that these smaller axes are thicker bladed and are really made quite differently to these massive axes. These are incredibly specialised weapons, and that's really the point on which this video hinges. And in fact, going beyond just these two Viking era types of axes, we could say, looking around the world, whether we look at Ottoman and Indo-Persian axes, whether we look at African fighting axes or even Native American axes, there are two tendencies. There are tendencies for large and thin bladed axes, and a tendency for thick and smaller bladed axes, and these obviously fulfill a different role in combat. By and large, and I'm going to massively oversimplify here, thin long edges are better for cutting flesh, and shorter edges, which are thicker blades, are more durable and make better weapons against armour. We'll come back to this point also later in the video. So this type of weapon, if you're going to be smashing it into helmets, mail or any other type of armour, is far more appropriate in general than a very thin bladed axe, probably for obvious reasons. But this develops into these more specialised axes. This is another axe actually from Thor's Forge, but this type of axe obviously develops a spike and is a more specialised thing, and in its turn eventually leads to the development of specialised plate armoured fighting axes like that poleaxe. So these are clearly better for hitting armour. So If we pretty much take that as a given, those thick-bladed, smaller axe heads, a bit like warhammers or maces, are better for mashing into armour, what does that make us think about this big Dane axe if it isn't particularly well suited for cleaving into armour? Now, it's always good when making assertions to actually revisit the evidence, archaeologically in this case, about these axes. So as I mentioned, Peterson's type L and M, I think they are. I'm not particularly good on Peterson's axe typology, but they're essentially very large blades. Some are a bit more forwards angled and some are more vertical angled relative to the shaft here. But the important thing that they have in common is they are long-edged, very long-edged by the standards of the day compared to the other one we just showed, number one. And number two, they are very, very thin. And I mean very thin, okay, down to like 2 millimeters, some surviving examples. Now there is variation. For example, there's an example which was pulled out of the River Thames that's in the British Museum. And that is a particularly large example, and it's relatively heavy and relatively, for the type, thick, although it's still thin compared to the smaller axes. But there's a whole bunch of examples in what I know as the Museum of London. I think they're changing its name to London Museum and relocating it. But they have a bunch of axes which were also pulled out of the Thames, believed at where the old Anglo-Saxon London Bridge used to be, where there was a Viking attack and they tried to pull down the bridge, and a load of weapons ended up in the riverbanks and archaeologists found them. And some of them are exceptionally thin in the blade. So thin that in fact many of them have rusted completely through, but you can pretty much see where their original thickness was, and they're really, really thin. So these are very long, very big, but they're actually very light, very thin, quite fragile, it has to be said. Now, I've made a big point in the past about this reinforced blade, so hopefully you'll be able to see here that this, and this is one of the great things that Tord at Thor's Forge managed to get really well, don't know if that's focusing for you, but here we go. The reinforced edge here is forge welded on, so that's essentially a separate bit of steel onto a softer steel or iron body. And this is obviously reinforcing what's an incredibly thin blade. So they saw the need to reinforce that edge to make it a little bit stronger. But here's the interesting thing, at least to me and for the purposes of this video, not all of them have that. Some of them are just a really thin, really sharp blade, which isn't very well suited for smashing into mail, aka chainmail, and helmets, possibly even shields and things like that. It is a fragile blade. And we have to factor into this as well, not only are these thin and fragile, but using period, you know, circa 1000 AD steel, it would be even weaker because there'd be slag and all sorts of other things mixed into the steel, and they would be relatively fragile compared to a typical thick axe head. So they went to great lengths to make a weapon that was both thin, light, but also the downside of that is therefore fragile, with a super long, super sharp edge. So here's the question. Were these specialised horse-killing weapons? But is there any actual evidence to support this? Well, I'd argue there actually is. But before we delve into that evidence, a quick word from our sponsors for this video. Now, briefly before we go on, I want to tell you really quickly about the amazing sponsor we've got for this video, Private Internet Access VPN. Now, these days, I'm pretty sure all of you know exactly what a VPN is. And many of us are finding the need to use VPNs more than ever before. I am in the UK after all, but this applies to all of you. Researching anything on the internet right now is like reading only the summary on the back of the book without the main contents, and letting everyone know what's in your backpack while you do it. And the two main reasons why you'll probably want to be using a VPN is to increase your security, or because the content you want to access is restricted. Using a VPN is basically like armoring your communication and defending your freedom every time you log on in somewhere like a train station or a hotel or even at the gym. You're vulnerable. By using a VPN, all of your information and your online transactions go through an encrypted tunnel. Various governments and states are looking to get hold of, control and pry into your use of the internet. Obviously, this is a massively hot topic in the UK right now, thanks to the Online Safety Act. But you know, this is coming for everyone. Now, by using Private Internet Access VPN, you can change your IP so that you appear in one of 91 different countries around the world. Or you can change your IP so that you appear in another state. And of course, this gives you the freedom to access content available to people from different parts of the world. Private Internet Access VPN is available for all platforms: Windows, Mac OS, Android, Linux, iOS, and many, many more. And something that's really amazing about private internet access VPN is that one subscription can cover unlimited devices just with one subscription. Private internet access is the world's most transparent VPN. They absolutely never record or store their users' data. And this VPN works with all major streaming services, which means that you can access more of the content from all over the world. And it currently has a Trustpilot rating of excellent with 4.3. Signing up's absolutely risk-free. You have a 30-day money-back guarantee. So my fantastic offer for you right here, right now, today, link down below, is you go to piavpn.com/Schola Gladiatoria, or just click that link down below. That's an 86% discount on private internet access VPN. That's just $2.03 a month. And if that wasn't enough, you'll also get 4 months extra absolutely free. So thanks a lot for sticking with me. Now back to this evidence. Were these specialized anti-horse and therefore anti-cavalry weapons? So the evidence, well, first of all, let's look at the Battle of Hastings and particularly the Bayeux Tapestry. Now, of course, there are written sources for this battle and indeed for Stamford Bridge as well. We'll get to those in a minute. But first of all, the Bayeux Tapestry, as it's now known. So this was created by English, probably women, for a Norman patron, lord, possibly Odo, we don't know, and it's ended up in France, but it was English made, and obviously it's primarily about an English subject. Now, this shows numerous axes throughout the source. And the first point to point out is that the axes are quite numerous in there. So anybody that's seen scenes from the Bayeux Tapestry will have seen these great big two-handed axes, which seem to be relatively long because people are held with them with the butts on the ground, so to speak. But of course, they're shown not only in the military scenes, so the Battle of Hastings, but they're also shown in some of the civilian scenes as well, implying that they have high status. Now, what's also important is, and I think not that many people know that actually, there are one-handed axes shown in there as well, and it's very clear. We can see wood chopping axes, we can see carpentry axes used for building ships, and indeed we can see one-handed fighting axes used with shields, and indeed even thrown, I think, and we can see them in the same scenes as the big two-handed axes, and we can clearly see that the one-handed axes are sized like one-handed axes, and the big two-handed axes are big and held in two hands. We'll talk about the nature of holding them in a second. And it's clear that these axes are often in key scenes and key parts of the story. We can see, for example, Harold holding one when he's, you know, in the scenes where he's kind of in courtly life in civilian clothes. But in addition, obviously, we can see axemen falling at the hands of Normans. We can also see axemen doing things to Normans. We'll talk about that in a second. But in addition to that, they are, you know, prominent weapons, but they are not the entire weapon shown. We'll talk about the written sources in a second, particularly William of Malmesbury. But in terms of the art, we can see that they are often in the hands of people who sometimes have a shield on their back, sometimes are full of arrows, but these people are alongside normal soldiers with shields and spears held overhand. And so the majority of the army, as we'd expect, have shields and spears, and some people who seem to be on the flanks, we'll come back to that in a second, seem to have two-handed axes. So purely to state, it seems like these are special troops. They aren't groups of axemen, they are axemen on the sides of normal formations of shield wall, if you want to call them that, with spears. Well, I've already asserted that these axes are physically probably more catered towards hitting fleshy targets, shall we say, rather than thicker bladed axes, which are really quite durable when hitting mailed figures or helmets or shields or things like this. And what's interesting is, as we look through the Bayeux Tapestry, as you can see here, time after time after time, we see the Dane Axe, if we call it that, big two-handed axe, being used to fell horsemen, and sometimes specifically the horse rather than the man. So time and time again, when we look through these examples, almost every example, if it's not someone who's just dying, is attacking a horseman, while the spearmen stand in a shield wall with their spears presented. So the axemen seem to be specifically targeting the horses, perhaps. I think it's also notable at this point as well that the axemen are usually shown on the flanks, on the end of a unit of spear and shieldmen. So they are usually there using their axes from the sideline of the main shield wall, formation, unit, whatever you want to call it. So it seems like perhaps they were put on the wings or sides, flanks of the formation. Now note also that I would naturally hold a two-handed weapon like this with a right-hand lead. Throughout weapon history, the convention is if you're right-handed, you put the right hand at the top end of the weapon if you're going to swing it. This is true of long swords, two-handed swords, pole axes, for example, halberds and things like this. However, it is really notable that as we go through the Bayeux Tapestry, again, time and time again, these axemen who are often attacking horses and horsemen have a left-hand lead. Now, why might that be the case? Well, if you think about someone with a lance underhand, I don't have enough space to maneuver a lance in here, but let's just grab a stick. So they have a spear. Now, mounted cavalry at this time using spears could use them in a number of ways. They might use them overhand like that, they might use them underhand like this, or sometimes they might sort of couch them or rather hold them down here. But the point is that when you've got a spear in your right hand and a shield, let's say, in the left, it's quite easy to offend anywhere around here, but you're not so capable on this side. And this is noted even in later 19th century sources, that if you can get on this side of a lancer, that's to your advantage. This side, they are very, very strong, well defended. They can even use their lance as a parrying device to parry with, but they can stab all round on this side, or lance all round on this side. They can on this side, and there are ways you can do it, and you can disengage it from here and use it backwards. You could even couch it under that arm, but it's more awkward. So, numerous advice going all the way through to the Renaissance and Napoleonic period, all the way through, tells you against a lancer to get on the side that their lance is. Now, if we have a left hand lead here, that is perfectly suited to hitting someone who's on this side, which would be the side that the lance is on. So it even looks like, not only is this sort of perhaps anecdotal, I could be clutching at straws here, saying that the axemen are only attacking the horses, but they even seem to be with a left-hand lead, which is contrary to pretty much most two-handed weapon use throughout history that we know of. It seems very specific and very deliberate that they are striking from the left-hand side against spearmen on horseback, aka lancers. Now, in regards to the written sources, there isn't an awful lot when they're talking about Hastings. Unfortunately, they don't talk a lot about the use of axes. It's shown mostly in the Bayeux Tapestry, which is one of our primary sources for that battle. But let's just hop across to the Byzantine Empire. Now, many of you will have heard of the Varangian Guard. The Varangian Guard were the emperor's bodyguards, and in the first place, they were probably, we're not certain, but probably made up of Rus mercenaries. So the Rus were essentially Vikings who came down the rivers and created certain settlements in what's now Russia. But they did obviously spread out from there. They also mixed and melded with local cultures as well and became their own sort of entity. But the Rus provided mercenaries to the Byzantine Empire. But after that, we also get Norse, famously Harold Godwinson, for example, serving in the Varangian Guard. But after 1066, obviously the Normans won at the Battle of Hastings, and there was I wouldn't quite call it an exodus, but there were a number of exiles from England who fled England and sought service elsewhere, for example Scandinavia and the Byzantine Empire. And so it's noted, and I'll read you a source in a second, it's noted that a very considerable number of English ended up in the Varangian Guard. Why is this important? Because the Varangian Guard were famous for using axes, two-handed axes. They are described in the written sources as using two-handed axes. They're sometimes referred to as axemen, and they are shown in the art with two-handed axes, sometimes with other weapons as well. They also sometimes served as cavalry. They also used swords and bows and other stuff. But they were famous, they stood out for and were different, particularly in the Byzantine Empire, for using big two-handed axes like this. So it's interesting, just evidence of the fact of how it links the Battle of Hastings. Orderic Vitalis, writing in the early 12th century, and says, And so the English groaned aloud for their lost liberty and plotted ceaselessly to find some way of shaking off a yoke that was so intolerable and unaccustomed, aka the Normans. Some sent to Svein, King of Denmark, and urged him to lay claim to the Kingdom of England, which he did. Others went into voluntary exile so that it might either find in banishment freedom from the power of the Normans or secure foreign help and come back and fight a war of vengeance. Sadly, they didn't. Some of them, who were still in the flower of their youth, travelled into remote lands and bravely offered their arms to Alexius, Emperor of Constantinople. So there we go. We find the Varangian Guard suddenly being swamped with English personnel after 1066, essentially. Now, why is this important to the use of the two-handed axe or Dane axe? Well, at the Battle of Dyrrhachium, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that completely wrong, in 1081, we once again, so this is only what, 15 years later, we once again find an encounter between essentially predominantly English axe wielders and Norman cavalry. And the written sources for this battle explicitly state that the axemen of the Varangian Guard drove the Norman cavalry before them because the horses were panicked, obviously wounded, and basically fled before the onslaught of the Varangian Guard with their axes. Now, in fact, the Normans won that battle, but they used infantry and crossbowmen, probably flanking, to do it against the Varangians. But the Varangians drove the Norman cavalry, and it's explicitly mentioned that the horses were driven away by the axes of the Varangian Guard, who at this point, at least a fairly large number of them, were English and probably exiles due to the Battle of Hastings. Now, I trawled through the written sources and I actually didn't find very much else talking about the use of axes at this period, particularly in regards to these big two-handed axes. There's been a lot written in secondary sources, but it's quite difficult to find primary sources that actually substantiate some of the modern claims. But there is one source, William of Malmesbury, and he writes an account of the Battle of Hastings. Now, it's a little bit of a problematic source because he unusually says that all of the English were armed with battle axes. Okay, now this is in itself not true. We know that the majority of the English would have had shields and spears, for example, and we know that a lot of the English had swords, and obviously some had bows and blah, blah, blah. But it is interesting that he mentions axes so prominently, and it might imply that the English, knowing who their opponents were going to be, now this is conjecture, supposition on my part, but bear in mind that the English had just fought the Norse army at Stamford Bridge in 1066, and then they had to more or less rush south to fight the Norman invasion. But who was fighting who? Well, it was, Harold Godwinson was leading this army, and he personally knew William of Normandy, William the Bastard, future William the Conqueror. He knew the Normans, he knew how they fought. He'd been, according to the tapestry, he'd been hunting with William. He knew about their horses. He knew they used large stallions. He knew some degree of something about their tactics. If you were Harold Godwinson and you knew that you just fought essentially a Viking army or a Norse army up in the north, and then you had to rush south to fight a Norman army, would you use exactly the same weapons and tactics? I would argue no, you wouldn't necessarily. You would, and there's been some questions about why did basically he create a new army to some extent. He probably had to pick up new soldiers in the south. They weren't necessarily all the same soldiers who'd fought in the north. I personally think it makes an awful lot of sense for him to call on as many anti-cavalry soldiers as possible. We'll come back to what makes an anti-cavalry soldier in a second. But if he was rushing to fight the Normans and he knew they were a cavalry force, and let's just for the sake of argument accept that this is an anti-cavalry weapon, of course he would come to Hastings with loads of axemen. So William of Malmesbury, therefore, might make a note that, wow, the English, they all had axes. Why would he mention that if it wasn't unusual? And I'm making the assertion here that perhaps they took a greater proportion of axes. It doesn't have to be different soldiers as well. It could be you, let's say you're Harold Godwinson, let's say you fought with a shield and a spear at Stamford Bridge, but you know you're going south to face Norman cavalry. So you put aside your shield and spear and you take a two-handed axe because you want to take out some horses. just an idea. But it would make sense of why William of Malmesbury is specifically mentioning that the Saxons fought with axes at Hastings. So that leads on to the question of why would you pick a two-handed axe to face horses and horsemen, cavalry? Well, there's a few ideas, and there's also some other bits of history and geographic regions that we can draw upon. But first of all, I want to talk about something that I might have been wrong about in the past. So I've always made the assertion that really, you know, the spear, I've got spears behind me, but it's easier to demonstrate with something here. The spear, okay, is a brilliant weapon against cavalry. It can be, but here's the thing. I'm used to talking about spears in the late medieval period when they are not usually used with a shield. They're usually used in two hands like a pike. Now, used like this, a spear is a brilliant weapon against cavalry. And in fact, you could say that pikes were in some way specifically designed, whether it's the Scottish schiltron or the way that the Northern Welsh fought the English, or indeed, obviously, the way that the Swiss dealt with their opponents. The pike is a brilliant weapon against massed cavalry with lances or any other weapons. But this is not the pike. What we're talking about in the Battle of Hastings era, the Viking era, the Norman era, isn't yet a pike. It is, number one, shorter, and number two, usually used in one hand. So we have to consider these two things. First of all, I've got a shorter reach because it's a shorter weapon than a pike. But secondly, I'm using it in one hand. Whether I'm using it down here or up here, it is a much weaker weapon than a larger and heavier version of this held in two hands. Okay, so number one, against a charging horse, this is far less of a security than a two-handed pike or halberd or bill would be, because this is both lighter and it's only in one hand, and it's much weaker against a large, heavy, fast-moving animal. But secondly, we've also got the issue of what the horsemen do themselves. Now, Norman cavalry in general would be riding around and either throwing some spears, we know that did that sometimes, or hitting and then riding off. They are not, at this point, couching the lance and ramming straight into infantry blocks. They are instead riding past, stabbing them as they go past, and then probably wheeling around and wheeling off. So a different type of tactics, I think, to some people think about heavy cavalry. That's the first thing. But the second thing is they are using pretty much the same spears as the people on foot. So in many cases, the people on foot with spears, yeah, the spear's got a great reach, but it's not necessarily got any better reach than the person on horseback who's offending you. Now, a small stab can be sustained by a horse, and many horses received bullet wounds and arrows and all sorts of other things and carried on. We've got multiple accounts through history of this happening. However, a Dane Axe is a different beast. So here, without getting too gratuitous, I think there are two things to consider. First of all, a hit from a Dane Axe, which can have a considerable reach to it. We know that these things from the Bayeux Tapestry are, you know, can be chest height because they're shown as such. A strike with a full extension holding at the back of the shaft can strike really quite far away, pretty much the same reach as a one-handed spear of this period. They're not particularly long lances at this time. So this hit can certainly hit the horse in the front, in the flanks if it's turning and going away, or indeed in the head or neck. And in fact, this is what we see in the Bayeux Tapestry. So in terms of reach, this is sufficient. But in terms of wound, this is so much more potent, because this is like a huge great meat cleaver at the end of a long stick. So when this hits a horse, it's not going to be a simple poke, a simple stab from a one-handed spear. This is going to be a horrible, horrible, grievous wound that will, as we saw later in the year 1081 with the Varangian Guard, really panic horses and drive them before. So I think this is a shock and awe weapon that would have a far bigger both wounding effect but also moral effect on horses. This is a little bit more conjectural, but also I believe that the act of waving things like this is more interpretable to horses. And I know various people who ride, including people in my own family. I might be doing some videos about this soon actually. But when you wave things at horses, they don't like it. When you poke things at horses, it doesn't seem to have the same effect. Funnily enough, humans are kind of the same. Now, if you want evidence of this, in the 19th century, people used to attach little flags to the end of lances, little pennon flags, and I tried to research what these were for, it turns out there are even techniques where you wave this in front of the opponent's horse to make it turn its head away, because they don't like things flapping around in their faces. So in addition to the wounds that these give, which obviously would teach their own horrible lesson, the fact that these are waving around are possibly more psychologically impactful on horses than simply a jabbing one-handed spear would be. Finally, I mentioned other times and other places. If we look at China, for example, there is a type of two-handed sword known as a horse-cutting sword. Obviously, China had spears and had shields and these weapons, and yet even in China, the two-handed swords were specifically noted as being horse-felling weapons. Is it that they had found a similar conclusion to the two-handed axe, that this was a weapon which was somehow more effective against horses than simple spears were? It's possible. There's even some anecdotal evidence that naginata in Japan were favoured for use against cavalry, and had been used, for example, against Mongol cavalry as well. So sword on a stick. So a swung weapon with a long edge and a long blade that does a horrible, great long wound perhaps might work better against horses than a spear does. So let's wrap this up and conclude. Fundamentally, I'm not saying that the Dane axe in any way, shape or form was only a weapon for felling horses. We categorically know that's not the case. They are mentioned in other contexts. For example, the Varangian Guard, in one instance, they cut their way through a wagon fortification. In other situations, for example, Battle of Stamford Bridge, there's the mention of the Viking or Norseman who's on a bridge and holding back the kind of Anglo-Saxon army single-handed, and is supposed to have killed 40 people single-handed with his axe. We don't know categorically that that was a large two-handed axe, but I think the implication is it was. So absolutely, we know that these were used in other contexts, not just as we see on the Bayeux Tapestry. But here's the thing. I think that there was an acknowledgement that these were particularly effective against horses. I also think that we perhaps might see them disproportionately on the Bayeux Tapestry, exactly because Harold Godwinson knew he was going to face a cavalry army, which was not something that Anglo-Saxon armies normally did. We normally fought Vikings, who fought on foot, exactly like the English did. So I think that quite possibly they picked up as many of these great axes, hence William of Malmesbury's comment about the Anglo-Saxons using axes. Maybe they picked up as many axes as they could as an anti-cavalry tactic. If we want to completely fly away with this idea, it's possible that the spread of these axes, which frankly were a relatively new weapon, they appeared in the 10th century and were in loads of sources in the 11th century, still in the 12th century, and obviously they evolve into later axes like pole axes, but they seem to have come about quite quickly. And was this a reaction by people like the English and the Danes and the Norse? Was this a reaction to the sudden spread of heavy cavalry around Europe under the Franks and the Normans? Quite possibly. It's entirely possible that this is the foot warrior's answer to the mounted warrior. So I think it's worth considering, and obviously we're dealing with a small data set of historical sources here. But even with those small data sets, I think we can glean some really fascinating details. And just a quick reminder that private internet access VPN can help make you more secure, safer in all environments, and give you more access to more of the web. Freer, in other words. So I've got that amazing discount down below, 86% discount. It's only just over $2 a month. Check out the link down below. And remember that you get an extra 4 months for absolutely free. So thanks a lot for joining me for this video. I, of course, have, as always, been Matt Easton. I will continue to be. I'm fascinated to know your thoughts and ideas. Perhaps even you know about other source material which I might corroborate this theory or might completely dash it to pieces. But I'd be fascinated to see your thoughts on this. Do you find it convincing? Do you find it complete BS? Down in the comments down below. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. Thanks obviously also to the sponsors for this video. And I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.